may have caught in the past couple of years a global outcry about what was up with people who were working on the 2022 World Cup. Mostly migrant workers, they faced just horrible conditions, working as essentially slaves with wages that were being kept and stolen from them, passports taken away so they couldn't leave home for their home countries, and supremely dangerous work sites where workers were being hurt and killed every single day. The outcry made a big difference, even if, frankly, some of the things that the Qatari government agreed to have not been enforced entirely. The 2022 World Cup campaign did put tremendous pressure on the Fédération Internationale de Football Association. You can see my French is terrible, better known as FIFA, to clean up its act on workers' conditions. And that isn't easy because, as you might know, FIFA is one of the most corrupt international groups, with bribes exchanging hands between countries as a way of doing daily business. The pressure meant that the 2026 World Cup will have, at least on the surface, a much clearer mandate to defend workers' rights. And when I say on the surface, I mean this. What's on paper won't mean a damn if there isn't a sustained campaign starting now, even if it's 6 years away, to hold the host countries, that's the United States, Canada, and Mexico, to hold their collective feet to the fire. Now, to talk about that campaign, it's always a pleasure to have on the show Cathy Feingold, the International Affairs Director of the AFL-CIO and the Deputy President of the International Trade Union Confederation. So this is a really incredible topic to discuss, Cathy, because I remember, as they say, I'm old enough to remember this incredible scandal that happened with actually the upcoming World Cup in 2022 and the horrendous conditions that migrant workers faced, especially in Qatar, as they started building the stadiums. And as you know, there was the terrible, I'm reading from a report here, the kafala system, which basically bound foreign workers to their employers. As you well know, there was no right to organize, really. And there was a huge campaign that you were a part of and the labor movement was a part of to pressure Qatar into abiding under some conditions. So let's give a little bit of background to that before we then jump forward 4 years to this incredible, really, step forward.
Sure. No, it's a really important campaign because the labor movement has always called out egregious worker rights violations in mega sporting events. Let's be clear, it's not just the World Cup, it's football games, it's the Olympics. So when Qatar, one of the most repressive countries when it comes to worker rights, bid on the 2022 World Cup, the labor movement really was concerned. And we ran a campaign called Rerun the Vote. We didn't think that Qatar should have received it. We know why they received it, because they had lots of money to pay FIFA. And they did not care about worker rights. And migrant workers from Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, come into Qatar, and they're forced to build these stadiums and turn over their passports. They have no freedom under the kafala system. Now, over the years of pressure campaign, the good news is just this past year, we were able to pressure the government to start ending the kafala system. So there has been some improvement. There are some worker committees that have been built of migrant workers in Qatar. We still have a long way to go, but there have been improvements. And now we got a global acknowledgement that you have to have rights in mega sporting events.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you mentioned that Qatar had a lot of money, that essentially means they were bribing, for lack of a better term, FIFA,
Right.
because as you and I talked about before we started recording here, FIFA is one of the most corrupt international organizations you could point to. Now, before we go to the next 4 years in 2026 and what you've established, let's just stick with Qatar. As I'm reading some of the conditions, it's hard to enforce them. There's some reporting that's come out in the last few months. I was reading a report by Amnesty, for example, that there's still problems with the right to organize. There's still problems with wages being withheld. So it's
Absolutely.
not as if all the problems have been solved, right?
So Qatar, absolutely. We have seen some improvements, but there's still a long way to go. You do not change something like the kafala system overnight. But what we did accomplish was the government has recognized they must dismantle the system. The corporate sponsors recognize that they cannot be part of supporting a system that represses the rights of migrant workers. So, yes, migrant workers are still struggling to organize. There still are not independent unions in Qatar. A lot of work to go, but some initial steps were taken.
Now, one other point about Qatar, it's not just that folks were not being paid, they couldn't organize. They were literally being killed in those construction sites. It was a extremely dangerous work site, right? And there was no protections.
Correct. No health and safety protections. There were multinational construction companies there
Yeah.
who know better, right? Who, if they're in other countries of the world, would have never permitted workers to work under these conditions. And I would say, out of this experience, the global labor movement, the International Trade Union Confederation, working with some corporate sponsors and others, out of this experience, created a global institution, the Center for Sports and Human Rights, to maintain a focus on mega sporting events and ensure that these games are not permitted to violate worker and human rights.
And now let's go forward. We're looking at 4 years from now. And this is really established, from your point of view, an incredible base from which to then enforce a whole set of standards for the games that are coming up in 2026, which I believe are being shared by the United States, Canada, and Mexico.
Right. So it's a really unique bid. The United States, Canada, and Mexico put forward a bid against Morocco to host the 2026 World Cup. And one of the things these three countries did was they agreed to the most robust human and worker rights language that's ever been negotiated in a bid for any mega sporting event. And so, they've got 6 pages alone in commitments that any host city must uphold just on worker rights, not to mention the LGBTQ rights, immigrant rights, and a whole robust set of rights that have to be upheld in each of the host cities.
Now, let's share a screen here to show folks what you're talking about in terms of where the actual World Cup is going to be held, so people get a visual idea of that. So the first thing is that, and for my audio listeners, you'll be able to see this online. We've got a map up of all the places that are competing in the metro regions of the United States, and then also 6 in Mexico and Canada. So talk briefly about the logistics of that.
Sure. One of the things, each country had to commit that they were not going to build new stadiums. So this is not like, Qatar, they were building new stadiums. Here, all three countries said, we have basic infrastructure. So you'll see the 3 cities in Canada have been selected: Toronto, Montreal, Edmonton. In Mexico, the 3 cities have been selected: Monterrey, Guadalajara, and Mexico City. That leaves, in the US, we are probably going to choose 10 host cities. Currently, there are 17 that are in the bidding process. Part of the bidding process includes they must show how they have engaged stakeholders, including the labor movement, and how they're ready to implement the it's called the United 2026 Human Rights Commitments.
Mm-hmm. And so let's go to that slide that you have on the metrics about human rights, the basic ideas, the metrics on worker rights identified by United 2026, and let's quickly touch on each of those points.
And you can, see it. It's online, so anyone that really wants to dig in, it's 6 pages here. But the metrics are quite robust. Looking at current or proposed policies that restrict worker rights. Think about those cities we just saw. There's right to work up there. There are places like Texas, where Dallas and Houston are bidding, where they try to outlaw project labor agreements. So there's lots to look at here. Existing efforts around procurement. What does it look like to embed labor and human rights into city contracts, collective bargaining agreements, project labor agreements, contractors' labor rights records? That's a huge one. Policies to address harassment at work. And this is a great one. Policies that give temporary and subcontracted workers the same rights as all employees. As you know, this is a big issue in our country around the misclassification of workers and who gets rights and who doesn't. Current minimum wage policy. You saw Atlanta up there. Atlanta's got no minimum wage, doesn't have a minimum wage policy. It follows the federal policy, very low. And so these are all really important issues that local labor movements with their allies should be raising right now as cities are in their stakeholder process. Let me just show you the other broader human rights commitments. We've seen in the past years how stadiums actually sometimes become the place of racist and homophobic chanting. And so they're going to prevent that. They need to show what they're doing around racial justice, huge issue in our country, accessibility issues, privacy issues, security services goes to some of the policing issues and housing rights. So this is the most robust language I have ever seen linked to a mega sporting event. So the labor movement is in the process right now, as we speak, of engaging locally with in a stakeholder set of meetings, and then those cities have to tell FIFA, what it is, how they've engaged the stakeholders, and what their plans are to meet these commitments.
Hmm. And it's great that we, the labor movement, you as a leader on this project, have 6 years to make this happen, but probably fewer because it all has to be in place before all these sites are selected. So I'm going to play the skeptic for a moment. And when you were talking about the three countries, Canada, the United States, and Mexico, I felt like there was a parallel to the debate that happened around NAFTA. And
Right.
in this sense, Canada, as you well know, and I'm explaining this more to my audience, not to you, because you're really an expert in this area. Canada has a much more robust labor rights regime compared to the United States and Mexico. The U.S., as you well know, is pretty rickety, and it often has to do with who's in power. We're going to get to that in a second. And then Mexico has had a very, very dicey relationship with labor laws. They say that they are trying to enforce the labor laws. Now I'm speaking under NAFTA. So why shouldn't people be skeptical that this is great on paper? This is a great thing to achieve for the labor movement to set these standards. But how is this going to actually get enforced?
Well, I think we do need to be skeptical. That's our job as a movement, to be skeptical. We will not take anything as face value, that just because we have beautiful words on a piece of paper, we know better than that. Our job as a movement is to enforce those words. And so the AFL-CIO is working with our state federations and local labor bodies to proactively put forward an agenda. And we're working with our local allies as well. We're not waiting for FIFA to tell us what we should think, but we're saying, in each city, here's what we need to see have happen. In San Francisco, there were conflicts at the stadium around wage issues. Well, that has to be resolved if that city wants to win the bid. Obviously, lots of issues in Atlanta, right to work issues. Now, we don't expect right to work to necessarily be resolved through the FIFA process, but it should be raised. These should be debated at the city level. And lastly, I would say, FIFA is a very corrupt organization that has been in the press. So we don't want to take everything they say at face value. We have to hold them accountable. And they've also continued their process out of sync with the reality of what's happening in all three countries, where states, because of the pandemic, are missing a lot of important resources. So a lot of people are questioning, if FIFA comes to our city, what happens to our transit? What happens to, are they going to ask for more money than they give back? Are we going to make investments? Are the hotel workers who've been laid off going to be called back to work? Are they going to be union? Lots of questions that we need answers to before the labor movement says we agree to supporting these games in our cities.
And do you have veto power? Can the labor movement say, no, this is not good, and basically say these cities should not be awarded?
We unfortunately do not have veto power. What we do have is the power to raise a lot of awareness around the process. So right now, the timeline is all stakeholder meetings have to be finished by the end of January. And then in the next months, FIFA will review. I mean, each city has glossy things they're promising. And then they're going to make their decision about which city gets it. At that point, the labor movement has a lot of work to do with our allies, organizing, looking at various sectors and contracts. And so we're really going to be on this, looking at how it builds power for workers and how workers get their fair share.
So does it help that you have a more friendly administration coming into power? Would a Biden administration and presumably a labor department, for example, have some sway and say that is much more then effective than obviously the outgoing administration?
Absolutely, we would hope so. I think this administration has already said this incoming administration has said that they have a strong commitment to policies that work for working people and the environment. And so our expectation is when FIFA comes pressuring for tax breaks, or traditionally FIFA has a special FIFA law, which that gets them out of a lot of liability measures. How the national government deals with that will be a really important signal. So we are hopeful. And I would just say that what else is at stake here is we're trying to create the model for all mega sporting events going forward. LA will be hosting the Olympics. We don't want to start from square one. When the Olympics come to LA, we're going to say to them, here's the language. Here's where you should be starting.
And you were telepathic in two respects in speaking about these issues. The first is I remember when Amazon just recently had this incredible competition to cite its HQ2, its second big headquarters. And I just remember these cities and states falling over themselves to give Amazon whatever it wanted, especially when it came to tax breaks. And when you mention FIFA tries to get these tax breaks, this is my concern. One of my concerns would be that you'd have these cities and states competing against each other to get what they think will be a windfall. I'm skeptical that any sporting event does great things for the economy, but that's a separate conversation. So that's something to worry about as well, that might end up pitting local labor movements against each other unintentionally.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of renewed skepticism because, we started this campaign pre-pandemic, and there was a lot of hope and opportunity the labor movement could leverage these conversations. Now, I think there's concern that, FIFA is stuck in time. They did some initial human rights assessments of each city, which is now completely dated. We know that we're facing a public sector crisis, a state level crisis on the unemployment issues. Our mass transit is being stressed. I know I was just talking to folks in Nashville. I mean, how are we going to move in Houston? There isn't even a good mass transit system. It's expected that 5 million people will travel to see these games. So, are we going to make investments that are long term investments that are good for the community? Or is this going to be a model where they come in, they just try to take everything they can for FIFA's own benefit? Our job is to make sure that it's the first model where they are there to make serious investments that are for the long term and the good of the community.
And here's my final question. And you kind of referenced it a few times. I thought it was great. The underlying point you kept making, which I want to highlight a little bit, is the notion in which this campaign can build power in these various communities for the long term. And one of the things that stuck with me was raising the minimum wage to at least $15 an hour and higher. By establishing and fighting over these specific things around FIFA, you can then talk to the communities that this campaign really develops about broader campaigns for workers' rights here for decades to come.
Absolutely. It's a great time to raise issues, educate the community, develop alliances so that you have a broad worker human rights coalition working on these issues. We're actually working with the fan association in each city. The fans really care that these games are done well. It also provides a wonderful opportunity for transnational organizing. We're already building campaigns with our Canadian labor movement as well as the Mexican allies. So it presents so many opportunities to rethink, at the community level, what are our priorities? At the transnational level, how do workers who are connected through supply chains and through these games work together to make sure they get their part in whatever the profit comes out of these games. And so I'm hopeful that there's a lot of opportunity here, and looking forward to this work in the next 5 years.
Well, even though I don't follow soccer or football, depending on how you refer to it, I'm a baseball fan. This is an important story, and I hope to bring you back and follow this as the campaign develops. And thanks for explaining it to my audience, Cathy.
Great to be here. And we welcome anyone who wants to join the campaign. I think it's going to be really exciting. So thanks for having me.